evening. My name is Anya Jabor, and on behalf of the Department of History, it is with great pleasure that I'm welcoming you to this evening's installment of the Presidential Lecture Series, and that I introduce our distinguished speaker, Dr. Alan J. Matisow. I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank Professor Richard Drake for organizing this event and President George Dennison for supporting this series of public lectures. Dr. Matisow comes to us from Rice University in Houston, Texas, where he is the William Gaines Twyman Professor of History and the Associate Director for Academic Programs at the James Baker Institute for Public Policy. But those are just titles. What Dr. Matisow is known for is for his scholarship in modern American history. He is the author of numerous books on the politics and economy of the 20th century United States. His most recent book, Nixon's Economy, is a penetrating analysis of how re-election politics drove Nixon's economic policies. His 1984 book, The Unraveling of America, A History of Liberalism in the 1960s, is a magisterial study of a tumultuous period in our nation's history. Dr. Matisow also has published books on the Truman administration and on Joseph McCarthy, and his current research, as those of you who were able to attend his afternoon seminar know, focuses on Carter, Reagan, and the end of the Cold War. But as a graduate of Rice University, where Dr. Matisow has taught since receiving his PhD from Harvard in 1963, I want to tell you a little bit about Dr. Matisow, the teacher, an individual who, over the course of his career, has been the recipient of a remarkable 9 awards for excellence in teaching. Since his arrival on the Rice campus as the hot bachelor professor, that's a quote, but I'm not going to attribute it, in the early 1960s, Dr. Matisow has challenged and inspired countless students. In the 1970s, he offered a course on the 1960s, which, as you might imagine, was immensely popular. But as one student who took the class was very careful to point out to me, Dr. Matisow did not titillate his students with tales of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Indeed, when asked what he was doing in the 1960s, he confessed that he spent most of those years in the library. Instead of relying on anecdotal accounts of the 1960s, Dr. Matisow insisted that his students wrestle with, as one of them told me, the real social issues. Lyndon Johnson's Great Society programs, the United States' escalating military presence in Vietnam, and contradictions and divisions within the American left. By the time I arrived at Rice in the early 1990s, Dr. Matisow had attained a reputation as a demanding and inspiring professor. Although I did not study under Dr. Matisow, I heard plenty about him from my classmates who did, and especially about his legendary red pen. My fellow students, who did take Dr. Matisow's classes, sometimes struggled to decipher his copious comments on their papers. More than one compared his handwriting to an EKG. And as the proud recipient now of an autographed copy of The Unraveling of America, I have to confess I had to ask Dr. Matisow for a little bit of interpretation beforehand. Nonetheless, my colleagues were unanimous in their agreement that Dr. Matisow's shrewd editing helped them to become both better writers and better thinkers. As I said, while I was a student at Rice University, I never had the opportunity to take a class with Dr. Matisow. But tonight, I'm very glad to be able to remedy this oversight and experience his legendary lectures firsthand. For this evening, all of us here in this room are privileged to be Dr. Matisow's students, as he offers his reflections on the Kennedy presidency from the vantage point of 40 years later. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Alan Matisow to the University of Montana.
I have to thank Anya for a very generous introduction. I'm glad that she talked to the right students. I have to correct one detail, though. I actually did tell them titillating stories about drugs, sex, and rock and roll. I'd also like to thank Richard Drake for arranging my schedule today. He has been most hospitable, introduced me to a lot of interesting people, and made sure I had a good time, which I have had in Missoula, so I'm very glad to be here. I've been invited to address the topic of Kennedy 40 years later. It is, it's a little more than 40 years since Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas in November 22nd, 1963. Actually, to assess President Kennedy turns out to be no easy assignment. He's become, in our culture, virtually a mythic figure. And there's a constant outpouring of biographies, histories, docudramas, even popular Hollywood films about the president. Some of these celebrate him, some of them debunk him, but so far as the general public is concerned, it doesn't really matter. Polls show that 40 years later, the public still regards John F. Kennedy as one of the 3 greatest presidents in American history. Well, it won't surprise you to know that historians are more divided on that issue, which follows from the contradictory legacy of President Kennedy. And if you're a historian with my assignment, the first question you have to ask is, what is it that we're actually going to assess? Well, we could assess the president's public persona, and he spent lots of time cultivating that persona. And the way he was seen as a public man in the early 60s was as a young, vigorous, wealthy man who had a wonderfully photogenic family, who was able to attract the best and the brightest to his service in the White House, who gave parties so glittering that all the literary figures and musicians and scholars who came actually never forgot it. And he was a president who was capable of inspiring the young with his eloquence. Those images of Kennedy, the public man, have survived over the decades, and I think are a principal reason why he's still so highly regarded by the public. We could also look at Kennedy, the private man. And that picture is less elevating. We know a lot more about Kennedy than we did even 10 or 15 years ago. We know a lot more about the medical cover-up that persisted his whole life to disguise from voters and potential voters just how sick a man President Kennedy was. We know that when he was in the White House, a doctor regularly visited him and shot him up with amphetamines to pick him up when he needed to be picked up. And we also know about his compulsive womanizing. In a recent book, we learned that President Clinton was not the first president to have an affair with a White House intern. The interesting thing is that no matter how many seamy details of President Kennedy's life come out over the decades, somehow his reputation is unaffected. His sins are almost bigger than life and have the ironic effect of inflating the myth. But there's another way to assess President Kennedy, and it's the way he would like to have been assessed, and that is as his role as a statesman. I don't mean in domestic policy, he didn't care about domestic policy, but I mean as a diplomat, as a Cold War president, as a man who dealt with the issues of war and peace. And during his presidency, there were a series of crises. Twice the president had to consider the possible use of nuclear weapons. They were the darkest days of the Cold War. And the decisions of the president and his performance in those years, in the early 60s, would help shape the Cold War down to its last days. So what I'm going to do in this hour is give you a history of President Kennedy in his conduct of issues of war and peace, and in particular, I'm going to take a look back at his relations with the Soviet Union. The first thing I think to understand about Kennedy is he was a child of the Cold War. He believed in it. He believed as a candidate and as a president that the major goal of the United States must be to mobilize resources to meet the challenge of the Soviet Union. As it happened, he launched his candidacy in the late 1950s in a period of great national self-doubt. And the reason for that self-doubt can be precisely dated. On October the 4th, 1957, the Soviet Union beat the United States into space by launching a 184-pound artificial satellite that whatever you do when you go around the globe. It was something that nobody anticipated. It was a blow to American self-esteem, since we assumed we were always so far ahead of the Soviet Union. And it generated a kind of panic. Because if the Soviets actually had rockets that could launch a satellite, then it followed they had rockets that could launch nuclear warheads across the oceans. And Nikita Khrushchev, the Secretary General of the Communist Party and the Premier of the state, emphasized that point himself when he claimed many times that the Soviet Union was turning out ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, like sausages. This, as I say, set off alarm bells in the United States. It gave rise to a belief, strongly held, especially by Democrats, that there was a missile gap. That while they were turning out missiles like sausages, the Republican president, Eisenhower, was turning out very few. And the Democrats concluded that if Khrushchev so chose, he could now, or in the near future, wipe out the United States in 30 minutes. That was said many times in the late 1950s. By 1960, the challenge was not simply a nuclear challenge or a scientific challenge. Under Khrushchev, the Soviets began to pursue an active policy in the developing world. Khrushchev had elbowed his way into the Middle East by befriending Nasser. In 1960, he got a foothold in the Congo. He was urging on the Viet Cong in South Vietnam. And this is what really galled the Americans. He was in the process, in 1960, of cementing an alliance with Fidel Castro, 90 miles off the shores of the United States. That was the challenge. And from the point of view of the Democrats, while all this was going on, while the United States was losing the Cold War, President Eisenhower, old and complacent, was playing golf. In his campaign for the presidency in the fall, Kennedy summarized this national anxiety with a slogan. It was we are going to get the country moving again. And by that, he meant especially we were going to recover our vigor in the prosecution of the Cold War. So in his campaign, he promised to build more missiles than the Soviets, to expand our conventional military capabilities to meet military challenges of any kind, anywhere in the world, to train more scientists than the Soviets, to win the space race, and to demonstrate vigor, youth, and the superiority of our system to compete and win the hearts and minds, as you like to say, of peoples in the third world who were allegedly standing on the razor's edge of decision. In Salt Lake City in September, he said, "The enemy is the communist system itself, implacable, increasing in its drive for world domination. This is not a struggle for supremacy of arms alone. It is also a struggle for supremacy between two conflicting ideologies, freedom under God," that's us, "and ruthless, godless tyranny." He won the election despite a heavy vote against him on the basis of his Catholicism, in large part because that message resonated that year with the American people. On January 6th, about 3 weeks before Kennedy was inaugurated, Nikita Khrushchev made a speech. This speech was addressed to several different audiences, and you could read it several different ways. It was, on the one hand, a plea for peaceful coexistence, and on the other hand, it was a promise that the Soviet Union would ride the wave of history and bury the West, in particular by promoting wars of national liberation. President Eisenhower read the speech and said, "The louder the man talks, the less he does." President Kennedy read the speech and said, "Here it is. Here's the blueprint by which they intend to take over the world." Or, as he said to his highest officials, he told them to read, this is a quote, "to read, mark, learn, and inwardly digest this. You've got to understand it, and so does everybody else around here. This is the clue to the Soviet Union." Eisenhower read it right. Kennedy read it wrong. And he read it wrong because he misperceived his opponent. And his opponent was Nikita Khrushchev. And his misunderstanding of Khrushchev was the error that underlay his diplomacy through the rest of his term. Who was Khrushchev? Khrushchev was born in an impoverished peasant household and escaped a life in the mines to join the Communist Party and rise to become a confidant of Joseph Stalin. In 1953, Stalin died, and the strongman became Khrushchev. In 1957, Khrushchev disposed of all his enemies and ruled the Soviet Union by himself. He was an autocrat, and he alone made the foreign policy of the Soviet Union. But he was not Stalin. Stalin believed that in the likely war to come, the Soviets would fight and win it. Khrushchev did not believe that. Khrushchev thought that war was no longer an option. And he made clear his views in 1956 in the 20th Party Conference of the World Communist Movement. It's the same party conference where he revealed the crimes of Stalin. But from our point of view, what was interesting in that speech was he laid the groundwork for a new Soviet foreign policy. That policy, he said, must be based on coexistence. War was obsolete. We would fight them, and we will fight them to the death, and we will win. But the competition will no longer be military, it will be economic. The winner will be that system that proves its economic superiority. He was trying to move the Cold War from a military confrontation to essentially a competition that was going to be peaceful. He believed that war was passé because he believed that any confrontation between the Soviet Union and the West would immediately elevate to a nuclear confrontation. And given the power of nuclear weapons to annihilate both sides, neither could afford to fight. War now was unthinkable. There was a corollary to this. If war was unthinkable, why do we have such a big army? That made sense in World War II. It no longer makes sense. And here, I think, is one of the most interesting facts about the tenure of Nikita Khrushchev. He acted on this belief. Between 1955 and 1961, the Soviet Union, under Khrushchev, slashed its army from 5.4 million men to a number almost half of that, without asking for reciprocal reductions from the West. It was an act of drastic, unilateral disarmament. At the same time, he gutted the Navy. He said, our ships, what they are, is fodder for sharks. And he literally took some destroyers and cruisers, broke them up, and sold them for scrap. Much, I might add, to the great animosity of his Navy. Why did he do this? Because he was desperate to end the wasteful investment that the Soviet Union was making in arms and take those resources and put them in the domestic economy and raise the standard of living of the Soviet people. And he did it too to demonstrate to the West his good intentions, because what he hoped was to enter a period of détente and negotiate disarmament agreements that would help reduce the military burden on the Soviet Union. There was another corollary to his analysis, namely that the wars of the future, there wouldn't be any, the military of the future would rely entirely on nuclear weapons. Not on bombers, they would be obsolete, but on intercontinental ballistic missiles. He did not believe that the Soviet Union needed a great many of these. He was a believer of minimum deterrence. All you needed to have was enough nuclear weapons that could inflict harm on the enemy to guarantee you'd never be attacked. He was not interested in bombers. He canceled the recent bomber. It was going to be ICBMs. Well, here's the interesting thing about Khrushchev in this period. He had no nuclear deterrence. In the mid-50s, the Soviet stock of bombs was small, and there was no intercontinental bomber that could deliver these bombs on the United States and make a return trip. And neither did he have any ICBMs. He had unilaterally disarmed and had replaced what he lost with nothing, which put the national security of the Soviet Union at risk. That was Khrushchev's problem. And he solved that problem in a characteristic way. He bluffed. And when he said that he was turning out intercontinental ballistic missiles like sausage, he was lying. They had none. But of course, there was a self-defeating contradiction here. Often Khrushchev was his worst enemy. On the one hand, he's unilaterally disarming to persuade the West to enter disarmament agreements. On the other hand, he's scaring the West half to death with his claims of nuclear superiority. And what he did was inspire the West not to disarm, but to increase its spending on defense. The problem was that too many people in the West ignored the reality of what he was doing and bought the bluff. And among those was John F. Kennedy. Despite Kennedy's warrior rhetoric during the campaign, Khrushchev had high hopes for him and began to send out feelers for a possible summit with Kennedy. By the time Kennedy was interested, however, in February of 1961, Khrushchev backed away. And one of the reasons why he backed away was that Soviet intelligence reported something that Khrushchev actually didn't believe because it was so incredible. It reported that President Kennedy intended to sponsor an invasion of Cuba. Of course, Soviet intelligence was right. When Kennedy took over in January, he learned that there was in Guatemala CIA agents who were training Cuban exiles for an invasion. Now, this was a problem for Kennedy. He had no moral qualms about invading an independent country and overthrowing its government, but he did fear that if he did this, and it was known to be an American-sponsored invasion, it would lead to anti-American riots throughout Latin America. So he hesitated until the beginning of April 1961. And then he laid down his condition for an invasion. The invasion was plausible denial. Okay, he said to the CIA, if you want to invade, invade, but keep our role in this so hidden that we can plausibly deny we had anything to do with it. It was an absurd condition. All you had to do in the spring of 1961 was read the New York Times, and you knew that there was going to be an invasion, and you knew who was behind it. Nonetheless, on April the 17th, 1961, on ships provided by the Americans, carrying weapons provided by the Americans, exiles trained by the Americans invaded Cuba, where they were immediately confronted by 20,000 armed Cubans. Kennedy had said to the CIA from the beginning, if you get in trouble, forget this. I'm not going to send in the Marines. They didn't believe him. And at the moment of crisis, Kennedy showed he meant it. He didn't send in the Marines. It was a perfect failure. In 72 hours, the invasion was ended, and the exiles defeated. Kennedy drew a lesson from this. Never again trust the CIA and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. But Khrushchev also thought he learned a lesson from this. Kennedy was inexperienced. Kennedy was weak. Kennedy could be bluffed. Kennedy could be pushed around. And in May of 1961, with that reading of the president, Khrushchev said he was ready for a summit. The two leaders were going to meet on the 3rd and 4th of June in 1961. Kennedy approached this summit optimistically. He thought he could charm Khrushchev, and thought that he could perhaps persuade Khrushchev to enter into a comprehensive nuclear test ban treaty. Khrushchev had a different attitude. He intended to go into his meeting with Kennedy and browbeat him and bluff him. And the issue that he intended to bluff Kennedy on was the issue of Berlin, the first great crisis, really, of the Kennedy administration. I want to tell you something about the background of Berlin to understand what was at stake here. The issue really wasn't Berlin, it was Germany. And the German problem, the most important problem in this period of the Cold War, actually had its origins in World War II. Before the Allies, the Soviet Union, the United States, Britain, and later France was tacked on, before they defeated Germany, they agreed to divide Germany into zonal boundaries, that is, military boundaries. In each of the zones, each country would have a zone. A military commander would be in charge of administration until there was a peace treaty and reunification. But as everybody knows, there was no peace treaty, there was a Cold War. And these zones became proto-states. There was East Germany, and the Western zones coalesced into West Germany. In 1955, the United States ended the occupation of Germany, and the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, became an independent state. Immediately it joined NATO. Immediately it began to build up a German army to an authorized limit of 500,000. And as a NATO power, it became a host to NATO troops armed with nuclear weapons, and it was, therefore, the nightmare of the Soviets. German militarism resurrected. Not only that, the head of the new German state was an inflexible communist named Konrad Adenauer. Adenauer despised the East Germans, would not recognize them, would consider no reunification of Germany that did not call for the disintegration of the East German state, and refused to recognize the boundaries that the Soviet Union had created by force at the end of World War II when they took a slice of Germany and gave it to the Poles, and a smaller slice that they gave to the Czechs. And worse yet, from Khrushchev's point of view, the East German state was a basket case. After the war, the Soviet Union carried away everything it could from East Germany. And by the middle of the 1950s, the East German economy had still not recovered and lived in the shadow of a prosperous West German economy. There had been riots in Berlin in 1953, more threats of riots in the mid-1950s, and the distinct possibility in the eyes of Khrushchev that the Soviet satellite of East Germany could disintegrate under the pressure of the West. That would be a catastrophe from his point of view, and it must not happen. Before there could be détente with the West, there would first of all have to be a stability restored to Central Europe. But every time he made a proposal, the West rejected it. And now, by 1958, he's getting desperate. There was one point of vulnerability from the point of view of Khrushchev, and that was Berlin. If I had a map here, I'd show you what I assume you all know, that at the end of World War II, Berlin was deep into the Soviet zone. But Berlin was the great prize of the war. It was the former capital. It was the biggest city. And so it was agreed that Berlin would have a separate status. It would not be divided into zones as Germany was. It would be governed as a single city by Allied commanders acting together, though there would be sectors for each of the powers for the point of view of policing the area. Cold War, now there's an East Germany and a West Germany, but East Berlin and West Berlin, but the city remained an open city. Every day, 40,000 East Germans crossed into West Berlin and worked. And when the East Germans closed their border, people who wanted to escape East Germany had only to go to Berlin, cross into the West, and fly out. But it was this western sector of Berlin, surrounded by East Germany, garrisoned by a small number of Allied troops, dependent on its access to the West, down the Autobahn and across the airspace of East Europe, on flimsy guarantees of the Soviets that access would be possible. So Khrushchev decided to use Berlin, hold it hostage to get the concessions he wanted from the West on Germany. And what he wanted above all was recognition of the East German state. So he initiated the crisis on November the 27th, 1958 by sending notes to the Western powers in which he said this: this situation in Berlin is abnormal, it's intolerable, and the solution must be the abandonment of the city by the West, its demilitarization, and its reemergence, the reemergence of West Berlin as a free city. He accompanied this aide memoire with a threat. Unless there was agreement on this in 6 months, he would turn the access routes, Khrushchev, over to the East Germans. Then the West would have a choice. It could deal with the East Germans for access, in which case they implicitly were recognizing East Germans, or they could fight their way down the Autobahn and there would be war. Immediately, a new panic in the West. President Eisenhower was under tremendous pressure to arouse the people to a crisis, to call up the National Guard, to increase defense spending, and in other ways prepare for a showdown. Eisenhower wouldn't do it. And the reason why he didn't do it was he knew that Khrushchev was bluffing. He knew Khrushchev was bluffing because since July 1956, the United States had been sending U-2 spy planes across the Soviet Union taking pictures. And while the U-2s were imperfect, those pictures pretty much showed that Khrushchev was not only not turning out Soviet ICBMs like sausages, he didn't seem to have any. It was a bluff, and Eisenhower knew it. And it must have been very tempting for him to go before the American public and reveal the bluff and shut the Democrats up. But he didn't do it. And he didn't do it for the following reason. He and Khrushchev had an implicit bargain. If Eisenhower did not reveal the bluff, Khrushchev would not commence a crash program to build ICBMs. As far as Khrushchev was concerned, a crash program was too expensive and it was a low priority. So the bluff was not revealed. Instead, what Eisenhower realized was that this 6-month deadline that Khrushchev so foolishly announced had put him out on a limb. And it was his job as president to save the face of the one man in the Soviet Union who actually offered some hope of peace. And so instead of saying no compromises, no negotiation, Eisenhower said, okay, let's talk about this. The situation is abnormal. And so there were 4 power talks. The East Germans got a courtesy chair at the conference, giving them some measure of implicit recognition. Khrushchev was so pleased that in May he removed the 6-month deadline. When the talks broke down in early summer, Khrushchev was invited to Camp David for a summit with Eisenhower in September of 1959. And there it was agreed that in the following spring there would be a big power conference. The 4 leaders of the former occupiers of Germany would meet and discuss Berlin, with the promise or implication by Eisenhower that there would be face-saving compromises. Khrushchev was so pleased that in January of 1960 he announced another reduction in Soviet military forces, this time 1,200,000, including 250,000 Soviet officers. But Adenauer was against any compromise, and Eisenhower was in no mood to force him into a compromise. And as the conference approached, it was clear that Khrushchev was not going to get the concessions that would have saved his face. In April of 1960, a U-2 plane was shot down over the Soviet Union. Its pilot was captured, and Khrushchev was infuriated. And when the 4 leaders of the Big Four met in Paris in May of 16th, 1960, Khrushchev denounced Eisenhower for permitting this violation of Soviet strategy, territory, and sovereignty, and broke up the conference. He would now wait for the next president. And that president, of course, was John F. Kennedy. In the beginning, Khrushchev kept this issue of Berlin on the back burner, but Kennedy knew it was going to come up and he needed advice. And significantly, he chose as his advisor on this issue Dean Acheson. Dean Acheson had been Secretary of State in Truman's second term and was as much the father of the Cold War as any other American. And as the years went by and he left office, he became more and more militant in his opposition to the Soviet Union. So on April the 5th, there was a meeting in the White House. British leaders were there, the American national security leaders were there, and Dean Acheson was there to give his report on Berlin. What he said was, make no concession. And because you're not going to make a concession, refuse entirely to negotiate. And if the Soviet Union actually does turn the access routes to West Berlin over to East Germans, send a division down the Autobahn. Prime Minister Macmillan, who was there, confessed later that what Acheson said had curdled his blood. Kennedy had other advice. It was essentially to follow the policy that Eisenhower had been following. And it was advice given him by the Soviet ambassador Llewellyn Thompson, who knew Khrushchev better than any other American. On May the 27th, 1961, Thompson cabled Kennedy. And he said, the president has a difficult task of convincing Khrushchev, on the one hand, that we will fulfill our commitment to the people of Berlin, and on the other, that it is not our intention to saw off the limb on which he has crawled. I believe that the best approach would be to tell him frankly that neither of our two great powers can suffer humiliating defeat over this issue, and that we would be prepared to work out some kind of solution which would save face on both sides, but essentially leave the problem on ice. One thing that Thompson proposed was having the two Germanys meet face to face to discuss unification. That would get nowhere, it would take a long time, and the issue would fade away, and Khrushchev's face would be saved. So here was the choice: confront him or conciliate him. Follow Acheson or follow Llewellyn Thompson. Kennedy, who really didn't understand Khrushchev, followed Acheson. On the second day of the Vienna summit on June the 4th, the issue was Berlin. Khrushchev issued an ultimatum. Once again, a 6-month ultimatum. If Kennedy, he said, would not agree to a solution to the problem of West Berlin in 6 months, that it should be demilitarized and become a free city, he, Khrushchev, would sign a separate peace treaty with East Germany, and the West would have to deal with the East Germans to protect the access rights. But he also proposed an interim solution to postpone a showdown. It was the same thing Llewellyn Thompson proposed. Let's let the two Germans talk about a possible unification and avoid the confrontation. Kennedy said there would be no free city, there would be no negotiation, and there would be no meeting of the two Germanys. Khrushchev, he said, was forcing him with a choice of accepting the Soviet action in Berlin, this is a quote, or having a face-to-face confrontation. Khrushchev became infuriated. He slammed his fist on the table, and he said, I want peace. If you want war, that is your problem. The place went so deadly quiet you could hear the clock ticking on the mantle. Finally, Kennedy said, it is you, not I, who want to force a change. Khrushchev, the Soviet Union has no choice other than to accept the challenge. The calamities of war will be shared equally. War will take place only if the U.S. imposes it. His decision, he said, to sign the peace treaty was irrevocable. Quote, the Soviets will sign it in December if the U.S. refuses an interim agreement. Kennedy, if that's true, it's going to be a long, cold winter. Kennedy went back home deeply depressed. He knew Khrushchev had beaten him up. He knew he had not performed well, and he took seriously the 6-month bluff. And if that bluff was serious, then he had to contemplate the possibility of a nuclear confrontation. He called on Acheson again, and on June the 29th, Acheson said, don't send one division down the Autobahn, send 2. On July the 8th, Khrushchev made a speech addressing the crisis. It was a speech to the graduates of the Soviet Military Academy, and he said that in his view, the Western buildup, especially by President Kennedy, it made no sense, given that buildup, for the Soviet Union, quote, to continue to reduce our arms unilaterally. He went on to say that he was suspending temporarily the 1.2 million cut that he was planning for that year in the armed forces, and he was increasing military expenditures by 25%. Kennedy was cornering him. And instead of pursuing unilateral disarmament, Kennedy had provoked Khrushchev into reversing the policy. Kennedy made his speech on July the 25th. On the Berlin crisis, he said, we have given our word that an attack upon that city will be regarded as an attack upon us all. We cannot and will not permit the communists to drive us out of Berlin. I hear it said that West Berlin is militarily untenable.
So was Bastogne, and so in fact was Stalingrad. Any dangerous spot is untenable if brave men is tenable if brave men will make it so. We do not want to fight, but we have fought before. I mean, these guys are getting ready for a war. In that speech, Kennedy called for a $3 billion increase in defense spending, an increase in the Army from 870 to 1 million men, more Air Force and Navy personnel, doubling of draft calls, congressional authority to call up reserves, and a program to build fallout shelters in case there was a nuclear war. Well, what was Khrushchev going to do? He actually was outgunned and he knew it. His bluff on the 6 months had been called. And so what he finally did was build the Berlin Wall. On August the 12th, 1961, Soviet workers and troops appeared 1 minute after midnight, and the next morning when West Berlin woke up, it found that the two Berlins had been severed. The first wall was barbed wire, just in case the West pulled it down. But when the West did not pull it down, it became a cement wall. Khrushchev said it was a triumph, but everybody knew it wasn't. The West was still in West Berlin. But worse than that, that wall, that was an ugly scar that told the world what it should have known anyway, namely that the Soviet Empire was really a prison. The interesting thing was that Kennedy never said that. He hardly ever mentioned the Berlin Wall because he had invited it. In his speech on Berlin, he kept emphasizing West Berlin, not the whole city. And in other ways, he hinted that one way out of this might be the partition of the city of Berlin. And when that city was severed, the truth was, although it was not appreciated at the time, that John Kennedy was a complicit. He'd made a mistake in the way he dealt with Khrushchev. He'd given him no out and forced a conclusion that was against the U.S. interests. But it was not his only mistake that year. He also knew, because of the new spy satellites, that the Soviet Union had only 10 to 20 missiles that were virtually useless. And he decided to do what Eisenhower did not do, which was to tell the American people and to call Khrushchev's bluff, and thereby get his domestic critics off his back. This was done in a speech by Deputy Secretary of Defense Roswell Kilpatrick on October the 21st, 1961. Kilpatrick said the United States had hundreds of manned bombers, Polaris submarines carrying nuclear missiles, dozens of ICBMs, and tactical nuclear weapons. Quote, the total number of our our nuclear delivery vehicles is in the tens of thousands. He said if the USSR launched the first strike, the US would have a surviving force that would be larger than the Soviets had launched. In short, we have a second strike capability which is at least as extensive as what the Soviets can deliver by striking first. Therefore, we are confident that the Soviets will not provoke a nuclear conflict. Khrushchev was in the midst of a major meeting of the World Communist Movement and was infuriated by this speech. 5 days later, the Soviet Union broke a 3-year moratorium on nuclear testing and tested a 50 megaton bomb. 50 megatons was more explosive power than had been exploded by all the powers, including at Hiroshima and Nagasaki during World War II. Khrushchev hoped that this weapon would restore the illusion of Soviet power that the president had just punctured. And that was only the second mistake. There was a third mistake that year. Late November, the president and his advisors met to decide on how many of their latest weapon system, the Minuteman ICBM, they should implant. Eisenhower thought 80 would be enough. But given congressional pressure for more, he had recommended in his last budget 400. Secretary of Defense McNamara agreed that 400 would be all that was needed, but he also said that the administration would be, quote, politically murdered unless we proposed more. What did they propose? They proposed building 1,200 of these things, to triple the number that Eisenhower had recommended.
that was later cut back to 1,000. There was no thought-out strategic rationale for this decision. It was entirely political. Or as Kennedy said at a National Security Council meeting in 1962, of congressional pressure for more missiles, I don't think such sentiment can be rationally defended, but there it is. At a time when virtually the Soviet Union was disarmed, Kennedy had radically escalated the arms race. And from this point, 40 years later, it might well be stated that of all his decisions, that was the worst. Khrushchev was not the only man that Kennedy didn't understand. He really didn't understand Fidel Castro. Never understood that Castro's grip on the island was really firm. And after the humiliation of the Bay of Pigs, he became more determined than ever to finish Castro off. In November of 1961, Robert Kennedy wrote, "My idea is to stir up the island with espionage, sabotage, general disorder in an operation run essentially by the Cubans themselves." Kennedy ordered use of, quote, "all available assets to overthrow Castro." So the Kennedy brothers set up a Cuban task force headed by an alleged expert on counterinsurgency, Colonel Edwin Landale, but it was really run by Bobby Kennedy. It was called Operation Mongoose, and the plan was to get rid of Castro. Lansdale had a plan by February of 1962. The plan called for eliminating Castro by October, or in other words, before the 1962 election. It was a huge project. Operation Mongoose had a budget of $150 million. It had 600 CIA caseworkers. It had 3,000 contract agents, and it ran a worldwide operation, the intent of which was to sabotage imports into Cuba and to contaminate sugar exports out of Cuba. It was also to fund paramilitary operations inside of Cuba, to destroy Cuban mills, mines, and factories. And of course, it included many attempts to assassinate Castro, including letting a contract to a mafioso. The goal was a general uprising, and if that happened, perhaps, or perhaps not, an American invasion to back it up. Kennedy was indecisive on that point. But just in case Kennedy decided to invade Cuba, the Joint Chiefs of Staff on February 22nd, 1962, approved a contingency plan for an invasion. By the spring of 1962, Khrushchev is a very troubled man. He has all kinds of problems. There's the Berlin problem. The government in East Berlin said, well, you promised to do something, you never did anything. The Chinese mocked him for his weakness. He's cornered. And so he said in a private communication to Kennedy in November 1961, "You understand, I have no ground to retreat further. There is now a precipice behind me." He was pleading for Kennedy to help him to get out of the situation he himself had created. Kennedy was of no mind to do that. In December of 1961, Khrushchev wrote again, "We must conclude a German peace treaty, and we will conclude it even if you don't agree." It was bluff again. There was no way he had the power to force Kennedy to do anything. Another problem was nuclear blues. It was not simply that Gilpatrick had revealed the bluff to the world. It was also on February 22nd, 1962, that his commanders told Khrushchev that his small force of ICBMs could not stand up to the Americans. In March of 1962, Soviet intelligence erroneously reported to Khrushchev that in June of 1961, the United States had decided to launch a preemptive nuclear strike against the Soviet Union, and that only the announcement of this massive nuclear test had deterred them. It wasn't true, but Khrushchev believed it. In April of 1962, Kennedy gave an ill-considered interview in which he said that there might be some occasions when America might
initiate a nuclear attack and strike first. And Khrushchev became increasingly convinced that right-wingers and militarists around Kennedy might actually take over and launch a first strike. And then there was the problem of Cuba. Khrushchev regarded Castro as a surrogate son, as the revolutionary that he once was in his youth, and was emotionally tied to the revolution. He knew about Mongoose. He knew about the assassination attempts. He was informed immediately about the contingency plan that the Joint Chiefs of Staff had approved in February to attack Cuba. And he knew that on April the 9th, 1962, the Atlantic Command staged a dry run for a Cuban invasion. 40,000 men on 84 ships accomplished an amphibious landing on the beaches of North Carolina and an island off Puerto Rico. And Khrushchev concluded, not without reason, that the United States was beginning to prepare an invasion of the Cuban island. What was he going to do about Berlin? What was he going to do about a missile gap where he was on the short end? And what was he going to do to defend Cuba? He was in Bulgaria in May 12, 1962, when he had his inspiration. The way to solve all these problems was to put missiles in Cuba. Then Kennedy would have to deal with him about Berlin. Then he would close the missile gap. And then he would save the Cuban Revolution. It was his own idea. He talked to no one about it. He had failed to consider the implications. He had no backup plan if the United States resisted him. It was him. The idea was this. He would send missiles to Cuba in secret, ensconce them there, and reveal the secret after the November elections. And what would Kennedy do? He'd have to do what Khrushchev did. When the United States put missiles, Jupiter missiles, in Turkey, right up against the Soviet border, he'd swallowed hard and accepted it. Now that he was going to put missiles close to the American border, what else could Kennedy do but accept it too? The Soviet military, which regarded this as a harebrained scheme, said to Khrushchev, well, how are you going to keep these things secret? They were 70 feet tall. Khrushchev said, we will disguise them as palm trees. The Soviet military thought that this was a great mistake, but they dared not tell Khrushchev. And so in July, a massive armada of Soviet ships began to carry weapons of all kinds to Cuba. They included 24, the plans were to send 24 medium-range ballistic missiles with a range of about 1,200 miles. You could take out most of the cities on the East Coast. And 16 intermediate-range ballistic missiles that could hit as far as the deep Midwest. In addition, there would be 42 light bombers, accompanied by atomic bombs, short-range cruise missiles with nuclear tips, and 50,000 Soviet support troops to make sure it all went well. And so the ships began. And when they began, of course, alarms in the United States. See, we told you, the Republicans said, they're going to turn this thing into a base, a military base for the Soviet Union. And some of them, especially Senator Keating of New York, said they're going to send missiles there. I know it. They're actually already there. Keating was wrong, but he had made a lucky guess. The Kennedy administration didn't believe that Khrushchev would send missiles there. It was too preposterous. And so they asked the Soviets, were they going to put ground-to-ground missiles in Cuba? And the Soviets said, no, we are not going to do that. And of course, Kennedy believed them. And so on September the 4th, 1962, he issued a public statement that was less a warning to the Soviets than an answer to his critics. He never would have made this statement if he knew that Khrushchev was lying to him. The statement was, there is no evidence of the presence of offensive ground-to-ground missiles in Cuba. This is Kennedy's statement of September 4th. No evidence of the presence of offensive ground-to-ground missiles in Cuba. Were it otherwise, the gravest issues would arise. Having said that, his hands were tied. If there were missiles there, he now had very few options. On September the 15th, ships departed from the Soviet Union with medium-range ballistic missiles aboard them. They arrived at the end of September. On October the 4th, 45 nuclear warheads also arrived, and the missile bases were nearing completion. On the morning of October the 14th, U-2 planes, U-2 spy plane took off. It was the first flight in 6 weeks to photograph the southern part of the Cuban island. 2 days later, in Kennedy's bedroom, McGeorge Bundy brought photographs of that U-2 trip, showing that the Soviets and Khrushchev had done what they promised not to do. They had put ground-to-ground missiles in Cuba. Kennedy said, "They cannot do that to me." The result was the famous meeting, actually 2 weeks of meetings of a group called the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, ExComm, the president's closest advisors. For a week they met in secret to discuss the options. At first the options were all military: a surgical strike to take out the missiles, or a general airstrike to take out all the weapons, or a general airstrike followed by an invasion to finish off Castro. At the first, Kennedy favored military move to begin with. But in the end, he wanted to delay. Every day they were bringing in pictures of more missiles. He couldn't be sure that the airstrike, a surgical airstrike, would get them all, or even a general airstrike. And in that case, who knew what the Soviets or the Cubans might do with the missiles that were undiscovered? So it was decided to open the crisis by giving Khrushchev a chance to back down. And on the evening, Monday, October the 22nd, Kennedy went on TV to let the Soviets and the American people know that we knew that there were missiles in Cuba and that they would have to go. And he announced not a boycott, which is an act of war, but a quarantine, which would go into effect the following Wednesday morning, and it was prepared to stop ships with military goods for the Cubans. Kennedy said the U.S. would not prematurely or unnecessarily risk the costs of worldwide nuclear war, in which the fruits of victory would be ashes in our mouth, but neither will we shrink from that risk at any time it must be faced. The threat of nuclear war. Now Khrushchev realized that his latest bluff had been called, and he didn't know what to do. On Wednesday morning, with ships heading toward the American naval quarantine, he ordered them to stop, which they did dead in the water, and turn back. And on some of those ships were the first shipments of intermediate-range ballistic missiles, which would never get there. On Thursday, it was obvious this wasn't good enough. The Soviets were not violating the blockade or the quarantine, but their work on the missiles continued. Friday, it was more talk of military options. Then Friday night, a private letter from Khrushchev. It was truculent, it was specific, and its tone varied. It was obviously written by Khrushchev himself. And in the document, like raisins in a cake, there was the elements of a deal. If Kennedy would promise not to invade Cuba, then Khrushchev would take out the missiles. Euphoria. But the next morning, Khrushchev changed his mind. He decided at that point that Kennedy wasn't going to invade and he should up the ante. Now he demanded not only a promise not to invade Cuba, but Kennedy had to take out the Jupiter missiles in Turkey. That had always been on Kennedy's mind. In the very first session, he said, why did Cuba put these missiles, why did Khrushchev put these missiles in Cuba? It's just as if we suddenly began to put a major number of medium-range ballistic missiles in Turkey. Now that would be goddamn dangerous, I would think. Like George Bundy, Well, we did it, Mr. President. So there was a discussion about whether to make the deal. Kennedy wanted to make it, but the trend of opinion on the XCOM was that this was a concession, it would sell out the Turks, it would shake up NATO, and it shouldn't be done. So the answer to the dilemma of the second letter was this: ignore it. Let's send a letter accepting the first offer. We won't invade Cuba, they take out the missiles. Fine. When the meeting was over, Kennedy went to his office, took along Rusk, Robert Kennedy, and Llewellyn Thompson, the former ambassador, and told them a secret that they were not to share with the other XCOM members. Regardless of what had been apparently decided, he was going to make a secret deal with the Soviets on the Turkish missiles. And that night, Robert Kennedy met with Ambassador Dobrynin of the Soviet Union, told him first of all that there wasn't much time, that Khrushchev had better settle tomorrow, and threatening an invasion. And then told him that the president was prepared to give assurances that the Cuban missiles, the Turkish missiles, would be out of Turkey in 4 to 5 months, on condition that Khrushchev never mention it, that be a secret deal, because if it was mentioned, it would make the president, Robert Kennedy didn't say this, but it was the reason he didn't want the president to look like he had been weak and made a concession. The next day, Sunday, the last day of the crisis, Khrushchev announced that he had made the deal, that he would take the missiles out because the United States was going to pledge not to invade Cuba, and of course did not mention the Turkish missiles. And the crisis was apparently over, though there was such a sloppy conclusion that controversy surrounded the deal for years afterwards. Having gone to the brink, Khrushchev and Kennedy stepped back. Kennedy now felt secure enough to make some conciliatory gestures, a great speech at American University in June of 1963, holding out an olive branch, followed by an agreement between the U.S. and the USSR to end all nuclear testing in the atmosphere, an agreement on a hotline so that the clumsy communication that occurred during the crisis of the Cuban missiles wouldn't happen again, and a deal by which the United States promised to sell wheat to the Soviet Union. But not all was settled. There was still the Berlin problem. And again, Khrushchev told Kennedy he was under tremendous pressure and asked for concessions, which Kennedy refused. And again, Cuba. In middle of 1963, Kennedy had qualified his promise to Khrushchev not to invade. He said one of the conditions of not invading was that Castro stop promoting revolution. Castro never agreed to do that, and in June of 1963, a scaled-down mongoose operation resumed to bother Castro in Cuba, and so did attempts to assassinate him. On November the 22nd, 1963, when Kennedy was in Dallas, a CIA agent gave 4 poison pills to a Cuban agent with the intent that they should be used to poison Fidel Castro. Nothing was solved. Khrushchev was weakened. His authority was undermined. In October 1964, he was summoned back for vacation, faced the Politburo, and was removed. The charges against him were that he had been an autocrat, that he had insulted his subordinates, that his crazy schemes to improve Soviet agriculture had failed, and that he had carried on harebrained schemes in the conduct of his foreign policy. He had promised results from his efforts to gut détente, and instead of getting results, he had humiliated the Soviet Union. And so the one leader who could have dealt with the West and was in fact attempting to disarm the Soviet Union was shown the door. And one of the people who helped ease his way out was John F. Kennedy, who didn't understand who the man really was. Kennedy would have had an answer for armchair critics like me. He gave it at the State Department shortly after the Cuban Missile Crisis, when he went there to congratulate the people at State for their role during the crisis. While he was there, he quoted them a speech, or a poem rather, by the Spanish bullfighter Domingo Ortega. Here's the poem. Bullfighter critics, ranked in rows, crowd the enormous plaza full. But only one man is there who knows, and he's the man who fights the bull. That's an interesting poem because it's so clear that Kennedy thought of himself as a bullfighter. It was a perfect image for him. A man in the arena facing a moment of truth. Kennedy liked crises. He thought only in crises could real statesmanship be manifested. He liked crises because it gave him a chance to face danger and be courageous. And he liked crises because they satisfied some deep romantic strain in Kennedy to be a hero. What he never understood, but which President Kennedy understood very well, was that diplomacy is not a bullfight. So thank you for your attention, and I'll be glad to take any questions, comments, criticisms, or whatever you got for me out there.
So Dr. Matusow is willing to take some questions. I'm his designated eyes, so please try to wave violently in my direction.
See him?
Oh, look, and he saw it and I didn't. Yes, sir. Yes, you.
From Kennedy's cabinet, which member of his cabinet do you think had the most influence on Kennedy, or the most power?
The question was, which member of Kennedy's cabinet had the most influence on Kennedy's policies?
Well, the two major advisors on foreign policy are the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense. Kennedy thought that Rusk was a bad Secretary of State, a weak Secretary of State, but he did rely heavily on Robert McNamara.
Did you see Kennedy as growing up in office, as maturing, perhaps changing that bullfighter attitude?
Well, yeah, I think so. By 63, he felt secure enough, as I say, to make some deals with the Soviets. And he also grew in domestic policy. He was a president who came into office indifferent to civil rights and ended up by becoming actually the leader of the civil rights movement. So there was a lot of change in Kennedy, and unfortunately, we don't know exactly where his journey would have ended had it been permitted to run a natural course. But I think there was some growth there, yeah.
Go ahead.
You mentioned early on that the Bay of Pigs caused and maybe poisoned Kennedy's mind towards the CIA and the advice from the Joint Chiefs. Did that ever change, or they had to be right occasionally? You just didn't rely on that information during his entire presidency, or what?
Well, I'd say that they did very little to win his confidence, even when they were right. I mean, it really irritated him that the CIA kept saying, you're not going to be able to overthrow Castro. He has a firm grip on this island. And that's why he formed a task force to take over Project Mongoose. It was his way of circumventing the CIA. And the Joint Chiefs of Staff performed abominably during the Cuban Missile Crisis. because Maxwell Taylor, who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and at least some of the other chiefs, kept pressing for an invasion. And in fact, General LeMay, Air Force Chief of Staff, accused Kennedy to his face of pulling another Munich, which infuriated the president. So, and Admiral Anderson virtually disobeyed orders from Robert McNamara at a crucial moment during the naval quarantine. So the Joint Chiefs of Staff were not really high on Kennedy's list of people to admire.
It's, what conjecture could you possibly give about Kennedy in Vietnam had he been able to carry through to 64? From what you know of the pattern that Kennedy had in his leadership, he seems to have dodged the bullet with his talk about Vietnam. He escalated our role in Vietnam, changed our status from advisory to combat. And I'm just wondering, Roger Luther wrote an article about how Mansfield had a huge discussion with Kennedy shortly before his assassination, saying we need to reverse our policy. And it's kind of an unnatural question, but I'll ask it anyway. What do you think Kennedy might have done?
Well, you're absolutely right. That's the subject I didn't talk about because I narrowed this fairly significantly. I think he would have done pretty much what Johnson did. I mean, at every step, he never went as far as the military wanted him to go or the Hawks wanted him to go, but every step took him deeper into the quagmire. And given his analysis of the world situation, of the stakes in Vietnam, of the necessity to defeat wars of national liberation, of his great fear not only of the Soviets, but of China, and a consensus. I mean, in 1963, you'd be hard-pressed to find anybody in the United States who had any significant, there were people like Mansfield and Fulbright, but there were few. The consensus was, you stop communism, and here's where it is, and you stop it here. And it would have taken an immense act of courage on Kennedy's part to say, this is a loser, we're getting out. The temptation was, let's just do a little more and see what happens. And every step took them deeper. And there is no indication on the record that I can see that Kennedy would have ever done anything other than what he did, or what happened. Though, of course, his apologists say that he would have done something else. It seems to me highly unlikely, given all his premises and everything we know about him.
Yes, sir.
Could you shed some light on the Kennedy assassination and specifically how so many, J. Edgar Hoover, the CIA, the Dallas police, how so many people could have covered up what apparently doesn't look like Oswald was able to pull off himself, but no one, including the Warren Commission, was able to give any clear answers to who was behind the assassination?
I always dread this question. Let me say this. I don't know. And let me say this also. I think Oswald did it, and I think he did it by himself. But I would not go too far along in my certainty on that particular assertion. That's a quagmire. It's a quagmire. And if you don't mind, I'm just going to step around it. It's not my quagmire.
A two-part question. Do you think the overestimate of Soviet capabilities in 1960 by Kennedy was an honest mistake or a politically convenient mistake to make? And the second part of the question is, what parallels do you see with events in the last year in Iraq on that school?
Well, I think it was an honest mistake, but he had a good political reason to make it. I mean, he had based a campaign on a belief in a missile gap and on a vision of Khrushchev and the Soviet Union's 800-pound gorilla. And it was a hard thing for him to finally admit that that was wrong. But I think he truly believed it. When he read Khrushchev's speech of January the 6th, he read it on January 18th, 2 days before he was inaugurated, and had access to information which might have corrected his misperception. So I think when he read that speech, he thought it was the honest blueprint, and it might have been convenient, but I think it was also conviction that Khrushchev meant what he said when he threatened the United States interests. Yeah.
You know, you talked about Cuba. It seems like the way this administration is acting toward Cuba is somewhat anachronistic. It's like, why is he even doing it? Why is he even paying attention to Castro today?
You mean Bush?
I mean Bush, yeah. Why is he even, you know, it's like it doesn't fit in. There is no Cold War going on now. There isn't rabid anti-communism, and it just seems like our energies are actually going to get us into more trouble than just live and let live, you know, type thing.
Yeah, well, I mean, we're dealing with ideologues here. And Castro is defined by the nature of his politics and history as the enemy. To these people, he's the enemy, and they're treating him like that. And there will be no cost, really. What will be the cost? We have all the power. There's 6 million Cubans. I mean, it's a policy that you can carry out very cheaply.
We have time for one more question.
I don't get this. I mean, I made a statement here about a national hero who I think conducted American foreign policy in a fundamentally flawed way, and you guys are just sitting there. I don't know what that means. I expected outrage and denunciation. I'm very disappointed.
Doctor?
Yes, sir.
Canonized Eisenhower on his view of Khrushchev, but the Berlin Wall is very similar to the North and South Korean DMZ or wall, and certainly what happened after Diem Bien Phu. So how is Kennedy's continuation of that policy is difficult to stomach right now? The way you're portraying it, well, it's something that's been going on for over a decade.
Well, you're comparing the Berlin Wall to the division of Vietnam at the Geneva Conference in 1954. Actually, the United States was against the division, and it was the French who made the deal, not Eisenhower.
Well, they made the deal so that they could appease the French for the German entry into NATO. It's all politics.
Yeah,
Different with what
the Soviets and the Chinese forced Ho Chi Minh into a bad deal. But so far as the Eisenhower's administration was concerned, they also considered it a bad deal and actually pledged at the Geneva Convention only not to upset it. But we were not a party to those agreements. Thank you.